In this tutorial we're looking at the processes of respiration and decomposition, and these are two biological processes, so we've got these biochemical reactions taking place, and the processes add carbon to the atmosphere. We'll begin by looking at respiration, which is basically a chemical reaction and one of the 7 life processes, so it's carried out by all living things. I'd like to start off and think about food chains. We know that a food chain always begins with a primary producer, and that's producing food and energy for the rest of the food web, the rest of the food chain. So we have a herbivore, the primary consumer, and then a carnivore being the secondary consumer, or possibly an omnivore, and then a tertiary consumer and our top predators. So what's happening to carbon? It's simply being moved along from one feeding level, from one trophic level to the next. So that's an important point in terms of the moving of carbon along this food chain. So cellular respiration takes place inside cells. So here's a typical animal cell, and here we've got a typical plant cell. So respiration takes place inside these cells. Of course, bacteria is an organism as well, so respiration will take place there. And all that's happening inside these cells is that food, or a form of fuel, nutrition, is being oxidized to make carbon dioxide and water. These are our 2 waste products, and of course respiration is all about releasing energy from this food so that the organism can live and survive. The energy might be used for movement, so the organism can move around. So the carbon locked up in the food is being released as a gas. So that gas is released into the atmosphere, but if the organism, perhaps a zooplankton or phytoplankton living in an aquatic environment, then the carbon dioxide gas would be released into the hydrosphere rather than the atmosphere. So now we're cheerfully moving on to think about excretion and death. Basically, all organisms, plants and animals, will release waste products, and they'll all eventually die. All organisms in our food chain will produce waste products as a process of living, as part of the life processes. So respiration will produce carbon dioxide and water as a form of waste. We know that these animals will produce fecal material. Cattle are renowned for producing methane gas when they fart. And in terms of waste for plants, then that plant waste might be in the form of leaves. Of course, all these organisms at some point in their life cycle, or part of their lives, will die. So what we have is a pool of carbon in terms of dead organisms and waste material. What happens to that? Well, if the dead organisms and waste material isn't eaten by other organisms scavenging for them, then that material is decomposed, and the decomposers are microorganisms, bacteria and fungi. They're going to make use of this material. So the non-living material forms a pool, and that might be referred to as detritus, the non-living material, decomposed by bacteria and fungi, and that decomposition produces carbon dioxide as a waste product. Of course, bacteria and fungi are part of the biosphere, and they're made up of fats and proteins, and those bacteria and fungi are specially adapted to eat that decomposing material, or the material that they decompose. So those dead bodies and the fecal material, instead of just being locked up, they're basically used up by microbes. So we'd say that the microbes are recycling that carbon. The microbes themselves respire. They're specially adapted to feed upon the dead materials. They oxidize them, produce carbon dioxide and water, which are released back in to the environment. So the microbes are releasing carbon dioxide back into the hydrosphere and the atmosphere. So in summary, we've seen how respiration and decomposition produce carbon dioxide and also methane gas, which is added to the atmosphere and also perhaps the hydrosphere too. So the plants and animals, part of the biosphere, they're a temporary sink, a temporary storage site for carbon compounds before they move on elsewhere into another sphere.